The transition of the region to the Eastern Caribbean region to a blue economy. This includes leading the tailored integrated Ridge to Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ, and green blue sustainable ocean management and chemicals pollution and waste initiatives. David, who is a retired naval commander, holds a master's in maritime affairs from the World Maritime University in Sweden and has diplomas in national strategy, policy, and decision-making and naval officers training. Next, we have Alanson Cruikshank. Alanson is a Vincentian geographer and urban and regional planner. While lecturing at the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College, he was involved in the South Coast Marine Conservation Area Project and was the environmental educator in the Reef Guardian pilot program. Alanson has worked on numerous disaster risk reduction initiatives in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, including the Strengthening Resilience in Volcanic Areas project. He was the national lead consultant for St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the CROP, the Caribbean Regional Oceanscape Project, National Coastal Marine Spatial Plan. So a member of the team based in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Alanson is a member of the St. Vincent and Grenadines Land Actors Platform, a graduate, member of the Trinidad and Tobago Society of Planners, and managing director at AMA Consulting SVG. Alanson is currently pursuing a PhD at the Islands and Small States Institute, University of Malta, in volcanic risk reduction. Next, Dr. Cassandra Titley O'Neill. Dr. Titley O'Neill is the Executive Director of Environmental Systems and a native BV Islander who has spent all of her life living between Virgin Gorda and Tortola. She has always had a passion for the sea and the environment, heavily influenced by her late father, Amos Jerome O'Neill. Sandy, as she is affectionately known by persons in the community and her colleagues, completed her BSc in marine biology from the University of North Carolina, an MSc in applied marine science from the University of Plymouth in the UK, and completed her PhD in marine biology from the University of New Brunswick. She served on the Marine Spatial Planning Team as Marine Spatial Planning Team lead for the Coastal and Marine Spatial Planning component of the OCS CROP. So again, another member of the CROP Coastal Marine Spatial Planning Team. And then finally, Rory Baksh. partner at Dillon Consulting Limited, that led the project with 24 years of experience planning across Canada throughout the Caribbean, including work in Trinidad and Tobago and recently in the Eastern Caribbean. He was the project manager for the 5 CMSPs, the Coastal Marine Spatial Plans that were produced under the CROP, and previously worked as principal planner for the British Virgin Islands National Plan and the Dominica National Physical Development Plan. I also want to acknowledge Emily Davis, who works with Dillon. We won't be hearing from Emily unless something goes terribly wrong. Emily has been working on the background to get this presentation set up, convene all our panelists, organize the Mentimeter, and generally keep us sane. So Emily is with us, but we won't necessarily be seeing or hearing from her. And Emily is based in New Brunswick, and she's an environmental scientist who was also part of the CMSP CROP team. And finally, myself, I'm an urban planner based in Ottawa, Canada. I've split my career between the Caribbean and Canada over the last 25 years. I was also a member of the CROP team. I worked as a social safeguard specialist and an urban planner, particularly on the St. Kitts and Nevis portion of the plan. And I bring you today this panel discussion. I am, of course, the one person here in the room, and then the other members of the panel are virtually participating along with all the online guests. And as a message to our online guests, I would also encourage you, you're obviously already online, but look out for the Mentimeter when we get to it, and we'll ask you to participate in the poll results. So with that, we turn to our slides. So this is our first test in advancing a slide. Here we go. So now we're caught up to the panelists. So this is going to be our first Mentimeter poll. So again, I've asked you to try to log in if you have a device. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do so. So it's www.menti.com. So if you log in, and once you get there, you have to enter a code, this 8-digit code. The numbers are up on the screen. So again, I'll give everyone online who are already ahead of those in the room in terms of being online, but some time to log in. Emily's monitoring the chat to see whether or not we have responses coming in. And now I'm checking my chat. I have to say, running a hybrid event, if it's a fraction as difficult as moderating a hybrid event, I have to give kudos to the organizers of the Caribbean Urban Forum for pulling off this hybrid event. A lot happening at once. So I'm going to be monitoring my chat to let me, so Emily will let me know when some people have started putting in a score. So we have one response. I assume not everyone is from Italy and Montserrat. All right, so this is great. So you've logged in. There's a question. So the URL to log into is www.menti.com, and then there's an 8-digit code 85896398, and that's in the small print on top of the slide. So we'll just give a minute for this. This was sort of the icebreaker, get you all logged in and using Mentimeter. We will come back to another couple of Mentimeter polls. So we'll just wait a minute here. All right, anybody having some difficulty logging in, assuming you want to? All right, well, why don't we wrap up the next few seconds and we'll move on to our presentation. If you're having trouble seeing it, I can repeat the all right, we have a couple of people just doing the final logging in here. All right, well, why don't we move to the next slide? So we're going to open with a presentation from Commander David Robin in St. Lucia. So go ahead, David.
Thank you very much, Chair. Participants, good morning, a pleasure to you. And if you're joining from further afield, good afternoon, good evening. It's a distinct pleasure to be able to participate in this activity, especially today, our penultimate day before our 41st anniversary of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And I would like to start by saying that the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the OECS, unequivocally embraces the theme for this year's forum, Beyond COVID, Recovery, Renewable Resilience. The Organization of Eastern Caribbean States is one community growing together within an ecosystem of integrated, sustainable, enduring partnerships, shaping a new economy on the front line of triple unprecedented challenges, risks, and impacts: climate change, the COVID pandemic, and the unsustainable cost of energy from fossil fuel, all seemingly to be mutating as external shocks. For us in the OECS, a new economy is, and I quote, an OECS green-blue economy is an economically viable, climate resilient economy that is based largely on sustainable domestic production and investment and pursues long-term prosperity for its entire population, in particular, its most vulnerable, through socioeconomic inclusiveness, responsible management of its coastal, marine, and other ecological resources, and transparent participatory government, unquote. This is echoed with the focus on the blue economy through our Eastern Caribbean Regional Oceanscape, Eastern Caribbean revised Eastern Caribbean policy, Ocean Policy 2020. Additionally, for the member states of the OECS, the ocean underpins their entire sustainable development agenda. And this is in particular reference to goal number 14 as part of sustainable development, and particularly those that address poverty, food security, water and sanitation, economic growth, reduced inequality, resilient communities, sustainable consumption and production, and adapting to climate change. We also have looked at the matters which pertain to our deliverables. So if we may be able to move on to the next slide, please. In this, we are looking as well as at several of the activities which we have undertaken, which are linked. And with this, we are looking at our transitioning to a blue economy. But we must bear in mind that for this, ocean governance and blue economy are dealing with sustainability, resilience, and these are holistic, visionary, integrated, and at the regional and national levels, and in addition, with cross-cutting deliverables. So at the regional level, we have the revised Eastern Caribbean Regional Ocean Policy of 2020. We have as well governance, which is through our ocean governance team mandated by our heads of government, and who now have the responsibility for monitoring and evaluating implementation of the revised Eastern Caribbean Regional Ocean Policy. We also have for the OECS Commission, which helps to drive the overall integration as part of our economic union, a GIS strategic plan and roadmap. We also have knowledge products, and some specifically to aid the OECS Commission in its lead through virtual reality, applied and application and equipment. Now, at the national level, there are 5 national ocean policies which have been delivered for the participating states. They are at the right side of our slide. Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. They participated in the crop. And they also had governance coordination bodies that are specifically established to support implementation of their coastal and marine spatial plans. 5 coastal and marine spatial plans, along with their roadmaps, were delivered, and these are where we also have 25 pre-feasibility assessment, 5 for each of the member states, from a total of 75 priority projects, which were developed in consultation with the member states and with support from the wider ocean governance team, which is beyond the 5 participating member states, and hence the integration as we move forward. Cross-cutting are regional strategic environmental and social safeguards. We also have the promotional and marketing strategy and plans for the CMSPs. We have as well strategic action plans to establish a blue economy in the OECS, assessment of sustainable blue economy financing option, regional marine spatial planning framework, which also supports our efforts for collaboration and ensuring that we deal with matters which go across boundaries and can impact us in an ocean environment which connects us and is not divided by geographical boundaries in the ecosystems. And of course, we have knowledge products, which is a range of ebooks, webinars, educate tools, and essentially we have piloted an OECS Learning Resource Center as part of the crop. So all of these, specifically the revised Eastern Caribbean Regional Ocean Policy and their alignments with the 2030 development agenda, is linked as well to all of the OECS member states. It is also linked to the vision and strategic priorities of the OECS, here shaped. Significant among these is reinventing the economy strategic priority too, but it is linked and integrated with the value in the environment, building resilience, social equity and inclusion, and of course, regional integration through all of this. I remind that we are stronger together, and as we move forward, we continue to be thinking blue. We are embracing as well, in our practical ways, a blue economy portfolio, which includes climate mitigation, protection of coastal communities, sustainable waste management, managed fish stocks, sustainable tourism, investment in renewable energy, enhanced marine transportation systems. And through this, we have had the foundational layout for our blue economy. With this, there are opportunities for private sector investment, and these are at the national and regional levels for investment through the national priorities for the coastal and marine spatial plans. We are also continuing to have engagement with other initiatives. Some are current and building, if you will, on the initiatives through the crop. Such there we have, for example, 2 projects, one with the World Bank, now focus, it's called in short, the UBEC, which is Unleashing the Blue Economy in the Caribbean. 3 OECS member states are current participants, and this is for an initial 5-year. It is an overall program project. This is through the World Bank, funded by the government of Norway. We are also looking at our engagement in partnerships through, for example, the World Ocean Conference. And one thing that is of note is for the Sustainable Development Goal number 14 is at this time the most underfunded of all the Sustainable Development Goals, only having reached, as assessed a month or so ago, 10% of where it should be. Significant with this is the importance of the ocean for our existence, for climate, and for keeping us blue so that we stay away from the blues of the impacts of climate change and their impacts and what they can do in our case or as we are on the front lines. So I would pause and say here that we would look forward, Mr. Moderator, Michelle, to your questions, and thank you very much.
And thank you, Commander Robin, for opening up our session. We're going to turn now to Rory Baksh, member of the Dillon Consulting team and who led our project as project manager at the Coastal Marine Spatial Planning component. So Rory, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. And as you heard from David, the blue economy really does offer a limitless set of opportunities for the Caribbean, and it is, from this, forward-looking and very positive perspective that I think brings a new level of excitement and energy to the Caribbean region. And in terms of, working as a planner and trying to unlock these blue economy opportunities, the first question is, what are the types of things we're trying to unlock? And, on the screen is a fairly simplistic view of the blue economy. There's so much more to it, but, things typically fall into these major categories around climate change mitigation and investment in renewable energy, and enhanced maritime transport system, waste management, managed fish stocks, sustainable tourism, and protection of coastal communities. And interestingly enough, to a certain degree, some of these may seem familiar for many of us that have practiced planning on land. And it's quite a dynamic opportunity for practitioners such as ourselves, planners, to take the skills of planning and bring them out to sea, where I think there's a lot of opportunity for transference of skills and to collaborate with a range of other professionals to help serve the interests of the country or the government that you're working for. So it's a very exciting time in the Caribbean to be a planning practitioner. One of my favorite quotes that I like to share with everyone regularly as it relates to the Caribbean and the blue economy is this one from Dr. Didicus Jules, the OECS Director General. And what he said is, the sea is finally coming to prominence as an unexplored and insufficiently claimed patrimony. We're making that mind shift from seeing ourselves as small island states to embracing our reality as large ocean states. And so on this question of what do you mean by large ocean states, the next slide really does kind of tell that story as it relates to the extent of the maritime boundaries relative to the land area occupied by various Caribbean nations. The area of sea is huge, it's gargantuan, it's massive. And if we're looking for opportunities for a bright future, why not look to essentially the largest thing that we have access to, and that is the sea around the land. And so from a perspective of then planning it and unlocking opportunities, there is so much to be planned and so many more opportunities to be unlocked. Under the work of the Coastal and Marine Spatial Plans Project, led by both Dr. Yolanda Aline as our overall team leader and Dr. Sandy as our Marine Spatial Planning team lead, we undertook a series of exercises that altogether formed this multifaceted project. I think that is indicative of what planners do and speaks to the integrated way that planning needs to continue to be done for the oceans. You know, across the region, there has been a move over the last number of decades to foster integrated planning, to see planning not simply as an exercise unto itself, but to engage with other practitioners, be they agricultural specialists or engineers, other types of scientists, and engage with communities. So very much so, this multifaceted, multidisciplinary approach is well tuned for planning to move out from land out to the sea. And through the course of that, the keys for success are about these meaningful partnerships, as you've heard me talk about, the ability for the collective group of practitioners to focus on action and to have a positive impact, and obviously to foster a higher degree of collaboration that leads us to this bright blue economy future that lies ahead.
All right, so that was a brief overview of the project from Rory Baksh, who is in Ottawa, Canada at the moment, I believe. Rory and I are based in the same city. We're going now to turn to, this is a setup for both a discussion and another Mentimeter question. So one of the aspects, an important aspect of the project, particularly the coastal planning portion of our project. So coastal marine spatial planning, we're integrating coastal and marine environments, land and water, and we did divide up our plans into two major parts. The coastal part really focused on investment priorities. And as part of the process of identifying projects, there was a prioritization methodology, which we'll be getting into in a bit. This next Mentimeter question is going to ask you, though, about the different aspects of the blue economy. So an important dimension of the blue economy, the approach we took, was that while it might be assumed that the blue economy is primarily about economic growth, depending on who you're talking to, or it might be assumed that the blue economy is simply about protecting the ocean space, in fact, it is a multiplicity of often competing priorities. And our goal was to identify projects and develop a program and a vision that was able to accommodate all five of these objectives as part of a vision for a blue economy. So the question for you on Mentimeter is, just want to make sure I get the question here. Which one of the following would you prioritize? It's a difficult question, but if you had to pick one, either from your own professional perspective, your perspective working in a particular country, working in government, which one of these five would you pick if you had to begin somewhere? So I'll leave that question with those online already and those in the room who are going online. And we're going to use the response to the Mentimeter as a way to segue into the first panel discussion amongst our discussants. So I'll give a few more seconds. There's some clear non-priorities emerging. So while you wrap up your voting, and the voting, I guess Emily will close the voting whenever she sees fit. I'm just going to begin to set up the discussion. So we're going to ask, we're going to start with Alanson Cruikshank in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we're going to be speaking about how the blue economy outcomes, some of these priorities, what did they mean in the context of some of the individual countries we're working in? So we're working in 5 countries. Alanson Cruikshank was our lead in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, so he brought a unique perspective to the team. And so Alanson, why don't I turn to you with these poll results in mind, where there's only 1 of 5 that got no vote. And in fact, that economic growth theme caused a lot of debate in public consultation, and a lot of concern that some of the early versions of blue economy plans were too heavily weighted to economic growth and not sufficiently weighted to any of the other outcomes. So it's interesting that in this room, which is a room of colleagues of planners in large part, that's not shocking that the focus on climate resilience. So Alanson, why don't I turn to you? And what do these outcomes mean in the St. Vincent and the Grenadines context? Well, I guess I was lobbying for economic growth. We got a couple of votes in there.
All right, good morning, everyone. And personally, I would just like to say that for me, the blue economy, as the name suggests, it involves creating that livable balance among environment, development, and social concerns in the blue space, in the ocean. And from the St. Vincent and the Grenadines perspective, one of the main outcomes in order to create such a balance was to create areas of mixed use and to have these areas properly managed. So that was one of the challenges that we encountered, was how do we get these areas that are so, that are vied for by so many users to be managed in such a way that it allows for blue economy investment, but also not to the detriment of the environment or the local culture or the social concerns. And looking at the poll, and based, of course, as Rory said, as Michelle said, those who are here in the meeting, there's no surprise that climate resilience is high on the list. That is a very important part of it. And when we consider even the projects that were highlighted, which I will get to soon, I'm sure Michelle will come back to me for that. The 5 different areas had to be taken into consideration. It was actually surprising to me that it's only 6% for economic growth, because at the end of the day, when we're thinking of blue economy, the livelihoods component is very important. And of course, that has an economic, I would say it has an economic connotation, obviously. But one of the things that, as Michelle mentioned, that has come into play is the fact that in previous iterations of blue economy plans, the emphasis has been really strongly leaning towards the economic side at the expense of others. And so we needed to create that balance. As I go into the projects, I'll come back to it again and specify for St. Vincent and the Grenadines how some of these projects really addressed these issues. So I'll stay there for now.
Thanks for those comments, Alan. Roy, we're going to turn to you. You've done a lot of work in Dominica, and what perspectives would you say are relevant, most relevant to Dominica, keeping in mind that they were heavily affected by Irma and Maria, and of course, economic recovery is obviously top of mind. What thoughts do you bring on Dominica and the blue economy?
Thanks for the question, Michelle. I think I have an interesting perspective to share that is front and center about the visceral human reaction that we have when we're faced with a climate impact, and I think that makes it top of mind in the individual citizen's head, in particular if there's been loss of life and property and belongings, and so your attention is turned immediately to climate resilience. But when we specifically look at Dominica from a strategic and blue economy perspective, it is a very mountainous, hilly terrain. It had an excellent kind of share of the banana agricultural sector many moons ago. It's shifted economically into different things. It's the nature island It has actually excellent aggregates that it provides to the region that it exports out. But because of its particular terrain challenges, there's only so much land-based economic opportunities that Dominica has to offer. I think the ocean is very important to the future of Dominica, and it's not simply about cruise ship arrivals, it's about being able to unlock other opportunities in the ocean. The thing that's very interesting about Dominica is that the shore drops off immediately and goes very deep. And so the question is, if we can get so quickly into deep water, what is there in the oceans that we can unlock as future economic opportunities? And so as it relates to the Dominica work, there is this perspective of, yes, of course, climate resilience, but we need to be able to maintain our nature island, but we also have to see good economy. I'd also like to footnote further that Dominica has the Kalinago, the only recognized indigenous group in the Caribbean, and they have their own territory. And within the extent of the coastal and marine spatial plans, there's specific regard given for the needs of the Kalinago and their future prosperity. And they are very much looking towards a future that is prosperous and supported by economic growth while following a resilient climate pathway. So, I think very interesting and unique perspectives from Dominica.
Thanks, Rory. And actually, before we continue on with Sandy in the British Virgin Islands, I'm going to ask the technical team if it's possible to show the faces while we're having these discussions. I see the slides. The slide deck was hidden for now, but I don't know if there's a way to show these people's faces while we're talking, and then go back to the slide presentation when we are back in presentation mode. And if not, we'll just continue on with the discussion. So Sandy, are you in Virgin Gorda right now, or are you in Tortola at the moment?
I am in Virgin Gorda. I just got back last night from Antigua from OECS workshop dealing with the tourism of cultural and heritage sites. And so for me, when I think about prioritizing for respective countries, if I look at my country, the British Virgin Islands, good governance for me encapsulates all the other topics. And I say this from a place of 2017, we had a record 3 flood events between July and August. And when I say flood events, I mean flood events that literally closed the capital and the country down. Shortly after that, we had Hurricane Irma around September 6th, I think, 2017. And less than 2 weeks, we had Hurricane Maria. And just as the country was getting ready to recover, our coral reefs, which provide so many ecosystem services to the people of the territory, both directly and indirectly, we were hit with stony coral tissue loss disease. And within the last month or so, we're seeing another diadema die off in the BVI. And speaking to people at the Nelson's dockyard, they're also experiencing the same thing in Antigua. And I think one of the things we really need to take note of, we have to have good governance in terms of putting out the necessary laws, policies to protect. It helps to protect as well as to guide the development so that we become more climate resilient. We can't just take up and go from where we're at. We will be affected by the hurricanes. For some of us, we have the threat of volcanoes. There's a threat of tsunamis, the last big one being back in 1913, the Puerto Rico tsunami. So we're in a region where it's like a melting pot. The impacts of other persons affect all of us. And I think the only how that we can minimize or use our conflicts is through the use of good governance as we move forward, and then the rest of the other topics will fall into place.
That's great. And again, BVI wasn't formally within the CROP team, the CROP group of countries, but obviously BVI is an excellent example of the kind of country that CROP is planning for. We're going to turn on this first of the series of questions to David Robin. So David, you have a unique perspective from the rest of the team. You see this from from OECS as a whole, and even OECS as a sub-region within a much wider Caribbean Sea region. How does OECS view, in your own work, how do you view these 5 outcomes of the blue economy?
Thank you very much. I want to endorse the point that Sandy has made, because once we have the good governance with all of its dimensions, inclusion of all of our stakeholders, equity, and all of what we are dealing with, and especially in our conversation as concerning coastal and marine spatial plans, it is essential that good governance assists and lay the foundation. Having said that, though, for what we have been discussing also points to the challenges in making these go forward. So we are, since small island developing states and territories, yes, we have worked together so that in the case of the BVI, which was not a direct beneficiary state of the crop, we have a member of our ocean governance team whose technical knowledge combined with all of ours certainly helped to shape what we did with the crop. In fact, through that member of our ocean governance team, the stony coral tissue disease was first drawn to our attention. And while we are looking at how we need to protect and preserve and to the extent possible enhance the biodiversity within our ocean space, the real challenges come how we link those in a practical way with the economic aspects, but still deal with, for example, what appears to me, it could be a matter then ship marine transportation related that may have to do with ballast water that can move species around which are not from our region and have those impacts. How do we then have the science and the training to move these forward? So it has to be a tremendous balance. It has to deal with capacity building. And so we also need to ensure that we have persons who are within the disciplines who can support. And here is where we look at the power of partnership. I want to say and commend even our team here that when we spoke and when I mentioned partnership today, there's an aspect of partnership even with yourselves who have been our consultants that we are have moved to a place of deep and genuine partnership, which we would characterize by friendship, and so that we continue to work together and support each other. So it is an integrated approach. We have to be visionary, we have to be agile in our responses, and often that comes with partnership. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for those words. And partnership through this 2.5-year project was very important. And related to that, of course, with any good partnership is important lines of communication, which were further complicated, of course, by not being able to see each other in person for 2 years of our 2.5 years in the project, as you all would have experienced over the last 2 years. So that was our first discussion. We're now going to turn to another portion of our presentation, which deals with how we got to a set of shortlisted projects, which were then developed to a certain great deal of detail. So we're going to just have a walkthrough of the punchline, which is looking at 6 projects that were identified through this prioritization process. Then we'll circle back to the methodology we used to get here. So I'm going to turn again to Alanson just to walk us through 6 examples of projects that were prioritized through this process. So Alanson, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Michelle. And just to say that the first of the projects was a locally owned. By the way, the projects shown here are not necessarily projects from one country per se, but really, in some cases, projects that was similar across the board in the 5 territories. So the first one is a locally owned tourism, locally owned tourism infrastructure. And just to say here that most of our tourism really, the ownership really lies without of the Caribbean. So it means that most of the earnings go outside of the country. And that is something that I think that we sought to really address in some way, and also to not have the investments on the scale of those mega all-inclusives that we are very accustomed to in the Caribbean, but probably smaller hotels owned by locals, so that more of the funds would stay within the country, and also the impacts on the ecosystems would be smaller. We had two fishing infrastructure projects, number 2 and 6. I pulled them together. The first one was fish landing and a fish landing site. We had several of those in the projects. Of course, we know that fisheries are a very important component to the blue economy. And we also thought of ways of what we'll call industrial ecology, or closing the loop, where fish waste can be used to make fertilizer in some cases. We also mentioned the possibility of using the sargassum paired with the fish waste to use in the making of fertilizer. And we also had coastal protection infrastructure. I will pair this one with coastal habitat restoration, because it's really to serve the same purpose. We cannot undervalue or understate, well, we simply can't, the value of coastal habitat restoration in terms of ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change and so on. The best methods of actually combating the issue is to use what is naturally there and to leave it there, or maybe enhance it by replanting or adding to it, be it coral reefs or mangroves. We also had a project that related to offshore renewable energy exploration, wind energy. It was mentioned in a recent workshop that I was in that the capacity in the Caribbean, the possible capacity in the Caribbean for wind energy is well over a few gigawatts. That's a lot of energy, way past what we actually need to consume as Caribbean states. So the potential is there for the investment, and it's just about making sure that it is done in a way that doesn't harm our future in terms of the environment for our progeny. So I'll stay there for now.
So, and what I should have mentioned is we're now going to have a Mentimeter question about these 6 projects. Probably would have been good for me to have mentioned that beforehand, but why don't we turn to the Mentimeter question? And in the interest of time, Emily, I think we'll just do question 1 of 2. This is just asking you to identify which of those 6, and I don't know if you want to see the image of the 6, but which of those 6 would you rank as the most preferred one from your own perspective, whether it's professionally or nationally, in terms of the kinds of projects you're already working on? Which of those 6 would you prioritize? I don't know if we can go back to the previous slide so people can see it. And maybe, well, I guess can we go back to the previous slide for just a moment, and then we'll come back to this to see others as the results come in. So which of these 6 would you would you prefer, would you select as the top priority from your own perspective? Locally owned tourism infrastructure is number 1, fish landing site and fisherfolk facility in the fishing sector, number 2, coastal protection infrastructure, number 3, coastal and offshore renewable energy exploration, number 4, and number 5, coastal habitat restoration, or number 6, fish waste to fertilizer facility. Those are the 6 that we're asking you to pick one from, and maybe now we can flip back to the score. This session is meant to end in about 40 minutes, so we are now just a little over halfway. I'm going to become conscious of the time as we go into part 2 here. So while these scores are coming up, I'm going to turn now to Rory. So Rory is going to provide a bit of an overview of how we actually prioritized projects, because we did receive a large number to start with, and we really had to slim it down, recognize working with 5 countries. Each country needs its own priorities. And we have coastal and marine aspects, 5 dimensions of the blue economy. So there were a lot of elements to work with. So why don't we turn over now? Rory, you're seeing the results. So again, a clear winner, if we can call it that. Probably consistent with the previous Mentimeter poll result of climate resilience as being most important. So there's consistency in the room. It's always can reward consistency. So Rory, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. And actually, I was going to make that same observation. I'm glad that you did, that our previous feedback from the audience was very much aligned to climate resilience, and here in terms of a preference as it relates to a specific type of project, there was an emphasis there also expressed as it relates to coastal protection infrastructure. And it is interesting in terms of the practice of planning practitioners and others that kind of function in this space. We hear a lot about the desires of our communities and our governments, trying to build an action plan and identify priorities. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges. There's a million things that we can do, and we realistically only have time, money, and people to do a handful of things. And how do we choose the best things that are going to be ideal for our community and for our country? And I think that was one of the innovations that we are pleased to share back to the Caribbean Urban Forum, as hopefully enhancing your toolkit to move your plans forward better and help them be more implementable, because that is key. Having the best bets, the best wins is a way forward to success. And so, introduced into this process were an important series of middle steps. After we did the thing that is common, which is gather the long list, we needed to filter that down. So we had to look at what the blue economy outcomes were that we were actually trying to achieve. We had to make sure that these were properly grounded and fit within the framework. So I think there's something there that I'm going to be expanding on as I tell you a little bit more about this. We then have to decide how we were going to score and evaluate them. And that could be a massive scientific exercise unto itself. You could write an entire PhD dissertation on scoring and prioritizing planning projects. We didn't have the time, but we had to come up with something that worked, and then being able to extract from that exercise what were the top priorities. To really put this all together, as you heard me say, we needed to ground them. And so on the next slide, we had 3 points in which we grounded this work: feasibility, relevance, and contribution to coastal growth vision. Those were the grounding principles. And we use those to then build a framework to assist us in drawing out from, in many cases, a list of over 150 ideas in each country, down to a prioritized list of about 25 best bets, with an understanding that as time, technology, funding, and other opportunities arise, something may get pulled out of the longer list again and get advanced. But we wanted to put our best foot forward in terms of setting out some of these coastal opportunities. So when we think about feasibility, and when you may choose to think about feasibility when you're looking at prioritizing projects in your planning exercise, matters such as the availability of information, whether or not it's just a basic idea or whether or not the idea has been more advanced and more pragmatic, that moves it closer to implementation, was very important to us. And if we do have a more crystal clear idea as to what this project is going to be, then it allows us to rapidly advance it should those opportunities arise. And in particular, recognizing that government has, again, limited resources, how much of this can actually be done in partnership with the private sector and advance kind of this mutual gain. From the perspective of relevance, as a practitioner, pulling that into an evaluation framework, trying to identify the best projects through a prioritization process. What we did is we looked at how much of this would support local resilience and reduce vulnerability. Obviously, this, I think, ties back to the philosophies of our audience today, who care very much about climate resilience. We wanted to ensure that the types of things that we were doing were respective of local ecological conditions and would enhance ecology as opposed to degrade them. And if we had areas of environmental risk, not exacerbate these risks. And then further, if we could improve the aesthetic values through some of these projects, then that helped move it forward in the list as opposed to setting it back in terms of a prioritization exercise. And thirdly, if you go through a process yourselves as practitioners, trying to identify priority projects in coastal space, we did also incorporate this question about how well each project fits with the coastal growth vision. Could it contribute to strengthening the local or regional economy? Could it reduce conflicts versus exacerbate conflicts in coastal space? Could we continue to ensure that those valuable waterfronts that everyone cares about can continue to be available for public access? and whether or not the individual projects could actually then support social aims such as job creation and gender equity. And in going through an exercise like this and assigning some weighting and looking at how each of these projects advance through these particular foundational elements, we were finally able to actually take a list of 100 and 150 and get it down to about 25 priority projects. And again, we learned a lot, and we thought this was quite innovative, and I'm happy to share it with the Caribbean Urban Forum today.
Okay, thanks, Rory. And actually, we do have a question from the floor before we turn over. So did you want to go ahead and, do you have a question? Well, why don't you start with the top one, and let's go to a mic, please. If you can also identify yourself for those that aren't seeing you.
Good morning, hello. My name is Sareme Cayetano. I'm the director of the Central Building Authority in Belize. My biggest question has to do with your selection, how you deal with the selection. Now, I understand that you said that there can be an entire PhD written on this thing. However, for me, from my purposes for my country and our development, I would just like to clarify a couple of things. The assessment, that the slide that you had up there was almost purely qualitative. How do we convert that to quantitative to, to be able to do a less biased assessment? How can we convert this to a matrix? I'm looking at the points that you made, that were made on the slide, and I'm looking at them. It seems to be a little bit subjective without direction to objectivity. And how does one limit bias in scoring? And finally, in feasibility, why is emphasis not put on funding and costing? I think I made a comment about that a couple of days ago, but I love the direction in which these things are going, but I don't think enough emphasis is put on funding and how do we finance these projects. And I don't know, maybe it's because, we find it difficult to get funding and receive finance, and maybe you all have very deep pockets, so you don't really worry about that. But my question is, how do we, how does a country like Belize get to that level where everybody else is at, where we don't have to worry about financing?
Okay, I'm going to summarize your question. And Roy, I'm going to ask you to try to answer this one. So I would say there are three elements, and we grapple with all three of those. One is, how do we overcome this inherent subjectivity and qualitative nature, a lot of these dimensions? Because we did convert this all into a score, but there was definitely a subjective process. How do you create a matrix out of this? And then how did we deal with financing of these projects? So I don't know, Rory, did you want to have a short stab at less than a PhD's worth of response to that?
I'm happy to do that, and I'm glad the question was asked, because we really offered a snapshot of what was a quite elaborate exercise. And
Roy, I don't know if you can speak up. I don't know if your mic is low or if there's a way to increase the speaker volume on this end, but.
Yeah, I'll speak up a little bit, Michelle. So I'm glad the question was asked, and I'll actually, start at the back of the question, which is about this financing and funding thing. I don't know any government that has all the money it needs, whether you're in the Caribbean or you're in Europe or anywhere else in the world. There's always more needed of a government than what it can fund. So I think that's a pragmatic reality globally. Things that we did to kind of reduce subjectivity is, when we built the framework, we had the 3 or 4 different practitioners each provide their individual work on the scoring, and then we merged those together. And so what that did was kind of eliminate individual bias and helped manage that. One of the things that we also did in terms of our scoring is, based on the advice of one of our risk assessment professionals, he suggested that instead of doing a scoring system of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that the weighting be 2, 4, 8, 16. And so what that did is it drew out through the scoring exercise a more significant score that allowed you to actually create distance between the less important and the more important projects. I think it's an interesting little technique that was used. And then the other thing is that through the course of the consultation and speaking with the different government agencies and identifying the projects we developed a fairly good grasp of what each one was. And so then we looked at them in regards to each of the principles relative to each other. So we looked at the feasibility, for example, of the group of projects. And then we did say, well, this one is a little less feasible because it hasn't advanced beyond just a conceptual idea. And this one is a bit more feasible because we've seen some plans and drawings and someone has actually put some more time and effort into it. And so we were able to then find those points of differentiation that allowed us to then assign a score, build a spread, and then come up with a final ranking. And I think there was another aspect to the question that I think escapes me right now.
What about a matrix and then the financing piece?
Yes, that is. So it all actually did go into a big matrix at the end, so that we could put all the numbers together, assemble them from the individual practitioners, average them out, and see what the final weighting was. To the other point, that was the point I was actually trying to pull out, the matter of funding. That was an element of feasibility. And if we knew that a project had moved beyond a good idea to, we had seen some drawings and ideas that we had then seen, for example, they had started to work on costing the project, but they hadn't necessarily lined up funding, then it continued to rise in the way that we looked at the scoring. And if we had heard, for example, that the government was going to start committing funds to certain things, and we're now looking for partnership dollars to help the project be fully realized, it again began to move further and further along the scale of feasibility. So indeed, we did have regard for the concepts of funding and financing as part of these exercises. So it was an excellent question. Excellent question.
And it speaks to the heart of the coastal investment planning that we were trying to get at. So that was really relevant question. We have time for one more question. I want to make sure we don't run out of time for our last question in this session. So I might skip through one or two other things, but we had one other question from the floor that we have time for. And if it's a short one, we might have one last one, and then we'll move on to the next topic. So please bring yourself to the mic, introduce yourself, and ask your pointed question.
Yes, mine is very short, right? And Leonard Francis from Jamaica, NEPA. One thing that has been worried me about all of the blue economy projects, right? How sustainable are they? And considering that the sea is so vast, and if you want, you can put the rivers in it, not an issue with me. How are we going to protect these projects from man-made issues and also from disasters? Because we have been grappling in Jamaica. How do we protect, right? Are we going to use a system of drones? What exactly are we doing? Or can we really protect them, especially further off you go offshore?
Okay, that was a short question that requires a long answer. And that answer is going to happen in our next topic, I think. And if we're getting into some of the tools we're using for how we make this happen. Did you have a short question with a short answer?
I'll try to keep
and
it
introduce
short.
yourself, please.
Oh, yeah, Simone Landucci, Open Plan, planning consultancy based in the UK. I've reviewed the methodology I've used to select the prioritize different areas. I think it's quite good. I have a question about the Pareto principle. So 20%, 80% of the consequences are due to 20% of the causes. How did you incorporate that into the methodology? Because I saw you have some question about what was the multiplier effect of some of these interventions, but that is one of the most difficult questions to answer for a planner or for any experts, because it deals with the future and how you model the effect of what you're going to do. So
I'm going to see who are the brave ones amongst our panelists who are prepared to provide a short answer to that question. I mean, Rory, I see your face, but does anyone else want to take a stab at that, Rory?
I was actually going to say it's similar in the line of like where Sandy's going to be going with the compatibility. So it might be actually advantageous. They're actually leading us to the next piece.
But beyond the compatibility matrix, there's something that is not touched in our presentation. We did a hotspot analysis based on what we're seeing on the coast, the potential for what is there, and how to move forward. And it was based off of a oil risk tool that was developed by Dylan. And so we did this for each of the countries. And so that, along with the compatibility matrix, is what actually helped us to model in terms of the future, where we are at now and in the future.
Right. So there was the PhD's worth of content on each of these coastal marine spatial plans. They're all available through OACS's website in draft form. But yeah, so our next topic is going to focus on some of what was being asked, which is how do you enforce, what tools do you bring in place to actually bring about that balance of economic development and protection that you're aiming for in the blue economy? So we're actually going to open up with a couple of Mentimeter questions. Maybe we'll just do we'll do the two of them. So first off, we're asking you, in the coastal zone, which of the following activities and features would you deem to be compatible with port and harbor operations? So if you have a zone dedicated to port and harbor operations, which of these listed here would you consider to be a compatible use, a permitted use that could be included? So the Mentimeter question is asking for you to score each of these as whether they are compatible or incompatible, if I understand the Mentimeter question properly. And then we'll have a similar question on compatibility in a moment. So is this Mentimeter clear to people? Right, so port and harbor operations would be deemed incompatible with coral reefs, but highly compatible with marine transportation, partially compatible with seagrass beds. And of course, that question of sometimes compatible or partially compatible is that gray area that is the difficult part. So I'll just give another couple of seconds for this one, and then we'll turn to a similar question in a moment, which is the inverse of this, which is looking at compatibility with a marine protected or marine managed area, an MPA or an MMA. So why don't we bring this one to a close the next couple of seconds and then flip to the next question, which inverts the topic. So this was compatibility with port and harbor operations. And now we're looking at compatibility with an area designated as a marine protected area, marine managed area, an MMA or an MPA. What kind of uses would you say are compatible or incompatible with MPA or an MMA? And of course, the discussion that we're going to get into is about a compatibility matrix that was created that is meant to provide guidance on a mix of uses for a range of zones in a nearshore area.
Michelle, while the Mentimeter results continue to flow in, I see our colleague Allenson has his hand up. Perhaps there was something he wanted to add.
Yes, just quickly, the question about funding, just to say also that we included in the plans possible funding sources for each of the projects. So we went a step further than is typical in most plans, because we know for sure that funding is always a big issue. So we included possible funding sources as well for the projects in each case, for each of the countries. So just to add that to what we mentioned before in the compilation of the matrices.
All right, so what's interesting about thank you, Alan, since that's our response to the earlier question about how we incorporated or accounted for funding and financing of the priority projects, or how we got to the priorities. So what's interesting about the responses here is that there is nothing that is deemed to be entirely incompatible with the marine protected or marine managed area. Of course, this is a limited number of options that we provided you. We are working with a much longer list. So why don't we move now to the next slide, which will be the background for our presentation. So this was the matrix. This is a snippet, the one corner of the matrix. It's a much longer and wider matrix, which spoke to whether a use is compatible with a given zone, whether it is not at all compatible, or whether it might be compatible in certain instances where management is required. So this was the matrix that was one of the core tools in coming up with zones. Why don't we now turn to Sandy and just provide some insight on how you, I mean, I think it was a bit of a struggle to come up with this, or at least to present it and to justify where there were in fact were a mix of uses. Do you want to provide some perspectives, just some brief perspectives on this? We have about a little over 15 minutes left in this session, so we want to get through this and then a couple more questions. But Sandy, I want to start with you because you were deeply involved in this exercise.
I'll try to make this as painless as possible. I will admit, and I agree with Michelle, it was a real struggle to come up with a compatibility matrix. What I will say to all the participants and those of you viewing online as well, that these compatibility matrices are not set in stone. These were built based off of consultation with members in the OECS who were participating in CROP, with some influence from myself. The BVI was not participating in CROP, but is an associate member of CROP, and having been a fisheries officer before, and some of the challenges that we were seeing, not just in the BVI, but within the OECS member states where we had consultation. And so this would be the ideal compatibility matrix. And what we also realize is that many of the places, you're talking about small island developing states. You're talking about an area where you have a limited amount of space land-wise, because everything that happens on land does affect the water, and vice versa. And how do we create these multi-use areas? Because you cannot, in an area like that, create something that is just exclusively, if you could put back up the compatibility matrix for a minute. You cannot use a place, I will just use in terms of a protected area. You can't just say it's a protected area. There should be absolutely no transportation going on within the area. That is just, it is not practical in a Caribbean sense. And that's why in those areas, you would see things like marine navigational routes, where it is likely compatible. We say likely compatible in terms of the fact that there should be some type of policy that would protect these marine protected areas. So you would have a situation or policy stating that persons who are using these, whether for yachting, for cruise ships, for the big cargo ships that are coming in, no dumping of your ballast water, no dumping of your waste within a certain mileage of your marine protected areas or the island on a whole, because you want to ensure that these marine protected areas function in the way that they're supposed to. One of the things I know it's not showing up there, but we did not recommend the use of fish pots within marine protected areas. And one of the reasons why we did that is because it defeats the purpose of the marine protected area. Marine protected areas are areas where fish usually go and they aggregate. And the premise for these areas are so that they are protected, so that the stocks, whether from coral, from seagrass beds, from fish, are then able to disperse to other areas that are more heavily fished or more heavily used. So in all the areas where you're seeing the yellowish or orangish color, those are the ones we're seeing they're likely compatible, provided that there's some policy in place. We would not recommend, or I should say from the consultant's standpoint and what we got, we would not recommend a port or harbor anywhere that is close to a protected area. There's no enforcement, and people, the ballast water, the whole thing with stony coral tissue loss disease. Now, we don't know what's coming in the ballast waters, what it is they're releasing. And so having the potential of those in an area, if there's a grounding, if there's an oil spill. So there's certain things, it could work, yes, but these are the ones that we would recommend based on what we were seeing throughout the region, which was a repetitive theme. And like I said, these are not set in stone, and these can be adjusted based on further consultation within each respective country and how you want to manage your resources.
Maybe we can move to this slide. I was going to ask Allison just to comment from a St. Vincent and the Grenadines perspective on this notion of mixed use zones. And I mean, the challenge of a mixed use zone is it means you have to, there's management required, enforcement, protection, and that's often where things fall down. Can you speak to some experience in St. Vincent and the Grenadines on mixing your uses, in this case, in a nearshore environment? We're not hearing you. I don't know if you're muted.
All right, sorry about that. One of the things that stood out to me when we were doing consultations on the nearshore and also for the coastal plan is it's almost what you would call a running competition, or maybe a standing fight between fisher folk and probably divers. So of course, the divers, they use the coral reef systems, they use the seagrass bed areas for recreational purposes. They would take persons there on tours to view the fauna. They will look at the seagrass, they will look at the different sites there underwater. And of course, they will do that at a cost. And when there's degradation, they would tend to blame the fisher folk. All right, so there is a passing of the ball, so to speak. And then the fisher folk would blame the yachties. I guess the yachties can't really blame many other persons because, I mean, the options start running out as you go down the line. But that's basically just to show that this area that is so heavily used by multiple persons, it's a very difficult area to really pinpoint what is happening in terms of who is actually responsible for some of the things that you're seeing occurring there in a negative light. So the question that was asked by Mr. Francis about monitoring is a very important question. It's a question that really, I think that we have to address in a very serious way. If we are to implement these steps in a pragmatic way and in a way that will actually make them achieve the outcomes that we want them to achieve. One of the things I would say as well is that within St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we, among the countries that were in the crop, we have 32 islands and keys. So persons from the Bahamas will be familiar with that type of setting. The BVI, to a lesser extent, not as many islands, but they have a few. And so it is a difficult thing to manage such a wide area or space and with limited manpower. One of the things that the plan sought to do is really to have extended contact with local authorities and really to track the way forward in terms of implementation as well. How do we manage these things when they're actually set up for such a purpose? Is it just going to be on paper and nobody really is there to enforce? And one of the things that I looked at was the Tobago Keys, which is a marine protected area here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which is properly managed. And so it is something that when we have other marine management areas in the future, it's a case that others can learn from here in the local context.
All right, so thanks, Allison. Again, we're going to, I think, run 5 minutes over with the blessings of our hosts here. We have another 10 minutes to go officially, but I just want to give Sandy a short opportunity to talk ever so briefly about one innovation in our project, which is about, we've been talking right now about the nearshore environment, but Sandy, if you can speak ever so, we're going to skip this Mentimeter slide. If you can speak briefly about our offshore marine zoning framework.
Okay, so apologies if I speak a little too fast. What we did for the offshore was something that, to the best of our knowledge, has not been done before in the marine environment, but has been used in the aviation industry. And so through consultation with the team, when you look at the offshore space, so we're talking beyond that, the last set of reefs, you have this space which is used somewhat currently in the Eastern Caribbean, but not so much. And when you look at it from a biological standpoint, you can divide these into 3 different zones where you can have different activities happening at the same time. So you have the photic zone where you have the sunlight and there are activities happening on the top. You have the middle zone, the pelagic, and then you have the submarine zone. And if you can move to the next slide, what we basically did is from each of those, we created a matrix that shows a compatibility matrix for the photic zone, the pelagic zone, and the submarine zone. Currently in the Caribbean, the submarine zone is used mostly for for any piping structure for telecommunications, and the pelagic zone in terms of fisheries and how they migrate from one place to the next. From the photic zone, things like offshore fishing, and the potential is massive. So what we try to do is now I will say we do not have enough data. So we were not able to go as in depth as we did in the marine spatial plans because there's a lot of data that is missing. We provided member states with what we thought were some of the areas that they could start to collect data. And again, like I said, these matrices can be changed over time, but this is just a graphic representation where it shows shipping, fishing, the telecommunications coming from the submarine zone up to where the island coast is on the coast. You have these different pelagic species, things like mahi-mahi, humpback whales, pilot whales, tuna within the pelagic zone moving between. And these are migratory stocks, which you absolutely have no control over. And then you have the submarine zone where you have things like sea monks and you have these pipes that are running. And what we did do is based off of the information that we got from each of the member states, we mapped where these were in respect to depths and all the available data that we were able to acquire.
Thank you for summarizing 2.5 years worth of offshore zoning work into 2 minutes or less, Sandy. And actually that speaks to, for the landlubbers amongst us, as an urban planner, the real fascination of this project was working with people like Sandy and Emily, who really understood environmental science, marine biology in ways that we had never done on a project. So integrating the water and the land through a set of tools and methodologies is a really, sometimes very difficult, but always challenging and satisfying process. So the offshore part was a really important conceptual part of our work. So thanks for that. I wanted to say the last discussion, as I said, and I want to turn to David Robin in a moment. And really it's the question about, so having done all of this, having created these multiple PhDs and huge documents, what difference does it make? And it really deals with the question of the challenge of capacity, the capacity of host governments to be able to absorb this information, to implement it, and to take policies, strategies, plans, policies, and turn those into any kind of change on the ground. And David, I hope you're still with us. If you can unmute, maybe you can provide just your perspective on this question of capacity in the context of a lot of our work, which is to create policy. But policy has to bring about change to be meaningful. So any thoughts you wanted to share with us on that topic? Well, we'll ask maybe each of our participants, but I'd like to start with you, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much for this most important question. Policy shapes everything. And even as we look at moving forward to get to places of governance, it is essential that policy informs what we need to do. In all of what we are looking at, there was also the question of, can we enforce? We may need to use new tools with partners. Some of that is under consideration because even as we take into account the OECS member states, we do have limited capacity to deal with our vast marine space. We talked about the limited land area using Dominica as an example. And when we do the actual multiplication there, using that example of Dominica, where it's estimated that about 12% of their land space may be accessible, we're really dealing with a lot, from a ratio perspective, a multiple of 8 when we look at the marine space. So having said that, here's where I spoke earlier about working with partners and having enduring partnerships. So it may be for where we are considering some aspects now of maybe from within the ECLAC region to look at the possibility of support to have from time to time, maybe building capacity, having persons who are in enforcement to be able to have board a vessel which operates in our region for some time, and then capacity is built on how you deal with matters that has to be done. It is absolutely essential. Again, capacity. We also need to continue the very important point that we have just come from, which is the science and understanding the sciences within the ocean space, the hydrography, the marine biology, and there are many others for consideration. So even as we do this, there are some other important links. The University of the West Indies is looking at the establishment of the 5 Isle campus, which will be focusing on the Eastern Caribbean and the OECS, now moving through the process to be established in Antigua and Barbuda. Again, what is important here is that we look at what is needed in the overall science, but to be able to deal with the bespoke deliveries which we need for capacity building. How do these then find their way into various areas within our competencies, and from the young among us to who would be the persons who would inherit, or from whom we borrow the future? Perhaps that's a better formulation, so that they can then build the capacities, and we can then, find ways in which we can really pique their interests, so that they can then become the ones who can look at how we move forward in a sustainable and resilient manner. So yes, I would stop here for now, but it really requires capacity partnership, and it has to touch lives on the ground in a real and impactful way, so that we can have the buy-in and the ownership by all our stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And in the final 5 minutes that we're going to take up here, I'll ask each of our panelists just provide some final words of wisdom. Sandy, we'll start with you next, just on the question of making a difference, capacity, or anything else you'd like to talk about related to coastal marine spatial plans.
I think for me, as a marine biologist and now a manager of a national park, I think one of the things I would like to encourage my fellow Caribbean counterparts, and for anybody who is managing an area where you don't necessarily have the funds, try to get the policies in place. I know it's a long and arduous process with governments, and most don't often seem to think that in the environment, like passing legislation for those are a priority. But my advice would be not to give up. It takes a lot of time. I just came back from the Nelson's Dockyard in Antigua, and I remember seeing that place when I was a lot younger. I would say I was still in high school, and going back and seeing this place over like more than 30 years, what they have been able to do with that site. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They have revamped the entire area. It was like a breath of fresh air. It served as an inspiration, not just for me, but for the other participants who were actually participating in that workshop. And I think for us, we need to use a lot more local examples of the things that we want to aspire to be, and to just never give up.
That's great. Thanks, Sandy. Alanson, any final words? Well, final sounds very ominous, but for this session.
Yeah, for this session. All right. Yeah. Well, I'd just like to say to our fellow planners, especially those who are working in the government service, I remember in preparation for this presentation, I was saying that the matrices will definitely generate feedback, because quite often decisions are made and you need to justify them. How do you justify them? How do you say that this was not a subjective decision made by our planning board or somebody else regarding our planning decisions? And I also remember a point that was made a few days ago, that one person said that the default position of our planning authorities in the Caribbean is no. And how do we get that from being no to yes? And one of the ways to do that, I think, really is to build on the expertise, not just within the planning discipline, but outside of it. We mentioned in the case of our marine expertise, Sandy, Emily, and many others, to really justify the decisions that are made from an objective, empirical basis. And so that, those who are making decisions can say, well, this is why we are doing it. It's not just because I like this area that I'm putting this development here, or because I do not like these people, that they're not getting a slice of the pie, so to speak, or they're not involved in the process. So I think that is really the standout for me, and something that I thought was very beneficial to me, and even in my own practice and my own professional development.
Thank you, Alanson. And Rory, your parting thoughts?
Yes, Michelle. I think during the course of this CMS Peace project, we heard, a few things. One, we need government to do X, and the other thing is, well, we planners, the best that we can do is plan. And I would like to kind of perhaps, encourage the dialogue to change and continue. I think, as a planning practitioner, if you really want to see your plans take life, do two things. One, see the opportunities that present themselves, and consider if you cannot also be an entrepreneur and take advantage of a business opportunity emerging in this bright future of the Caribbean. And the other thing is, be an ambassador for entrepreneurship in your community. Encourage others to get involved, to be business people, to be entrepreneurs, for them to take advantage of the future, for all of us to individually help grow the economy in the countries, and to create that future that is going to be a brighter future for the generations to come. There are limitless opportunities, and I think we can all play a part in that. And that for me is very exciting. And I look forward to seeing that growth in the Caribbean, because it's due to the region, considering the passion of the people and how much they care for their communities and the future. Thank you.
All right, panelists, thank you. From New Brunswick, Canada, Emily Davis is providing the backstop. I wanted to thank you in particular for keeping us going. Rory in Ottawa, David in St. Lucia, Alanson in St. Vincent, Sandy in Virgin Gorda, in BVI, and me here in Barbados, and all of us who are eagerly waiting to get back to the break. So thank you for indulging us. Thank you to our host of the Caribbean Urban Forum. Again, a great event, trying to make it hybrid in this post-COVID era. And we'll see you all in the room later this evening, or later this morning. Thank you, and thank you, guests.